and that won the day. The anti-federalists said, okay, we're still not happy, but we will in the states approve, ratify the new Constitution, just make sure that we get those Bill of Rights, or we're going to be very unhappy. So the Bill of Rights were not in the initial document known as the Constitution. The Bill of Rights became a matter of political compromise that allowed, in a struggle really over ratification, that allowed the states to ratify the Constitution because the Anti-Federalists were accommodated. So the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. And these were ratified in 1791. And as I said, they're a political compromise. So actually, a dozen of them were drafted by James Madison, but only 10 were ratified by the states. And they were designed to protect the certain rights and liberties of citizens. Now, the interesting thing and the very important thing about the Bill of Rights is this. The Bill of Rights was Bill of Rights was passed, was approved, but the 10 amendments applied only to the federal government, not to the state governments. And this is a bit might seem a bit odd, but it reflects the thinking and the political culture of the time, of a fear of quote unquote big government, a fear of central government. And keep in mind that Washington D.C. then was a lot further away from, Georgia than it is today. Just as an example. So, but it's very important to note that the Bill of Rights initially applied only to the federal government, not to state governments. And in a subsequent lecture, we will talk about how this changed slowly over the course of American constitutional history. In other words, eventually, the Bill of Rights came to apply to the states as well, but it took well over 100 years to do that. So the idea behind the Bill of Rights was to limit the power of the national government and protect citizens' rights against violations of their rights by the national government. However, it should be noted that from our point of view, looking backwards, state and local governments were given carte blanche to violate individual rights all the time, every day. 1791 was a world where Americans owned thousands and thousands, probably millions of slaves. 1791 in America, adult women had no political rights. 1791, many states even prohibited, essentially violated every day, the rights of Americans who did not own property. So it's important to keep that in mind. That's about 225 years ago, plus or minus, that in our early history and in our early constitutional history, the Bill of Rights was applied only to the federal government, not to state and local governments, and what we would consider to be wholesale violations, daily, normal violations of individual rights, were just a part of the political culture of the time. The Constitution describes a formal amendment process. And there's a chart of this in the textbook, and you can look at it. I'm going to call it up in a minute. By the way, speaking of the textbook, does everybody now have access to a textbook? Does everybody have access to the Ivy Tech website? Okay. If you do, on Blackboard and in your email, there should be a link, again, to the first 3 chapters of the text that you can access online, even if you don't have a physical book. And you must access that, and you should be, as I said, you should be through the first 2 chapters and reading the 3rd. And one other note, I probably will have to move back the due date on the first assignment perhaps a week, but I'm not going to move it too much, so you guys get with it. But I think I'll have to move it back in order to be fair and give everybody a chance. It's pretty hard to do an assignment if you don't have the textbook, but if you don't try to get the textbook or access to the textbook, and we've given you that at least for the first 3 chapters, then that's a problem, and it will cost you. Okay, the formal amendment process. Well, the simple fact is that amending the Constitution according to the terms of the Constitution itself is enormously difficult, very difficult. That the framers put an amendment process in the Constitution indicates that they anticipated that there would be need over the course of time to change the Constitution, and that new things would arise, new problems would develop that required an amendment. And I'll talk a bit about the specific methods by which the Constitution can be formally amended, but the more important thing is that it's very difficult, and in fact, since 1791, since the Bill of Rights was approved, there have been exactly 17 amendments to the Constitution that have been approved, none in more than 20 years. So there are 2 formal methods for amending the Constitution. The one that's normally used is that 2/3 of the members of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the members of the Senate must approve an amendment, and then 3/4 of the state legislatures in the 50 states must approve it. And some of the states have provisions that require more than a majority vote. So it's not just a majority vote in each state legislature. Some of them have, either 2/3 or even greater majority or supermajority requirements. And the key here is that the framers wanted amendments only when huge majorities supported them. This is one of the reasons why I said in the last class that there was a kind of anti-majoritarianism in the political thinking of the framers. They wanted change by constitutional amendment only when there was a broad consensus among all the political actors, state and federal, that the Constitution needed to be amended. So this is a very difficult process. And it's one. There is another way of amending the Constitution that involves calls for a constitutional convention, and basically that's not happened. So this is the normal formal way the Constitution gets amended. It's not the only way, and in fact, I would argue strongly it's not the most important way. So this is that image I was referring to that, from the text that lays out what the options are in terms of a formal amendment to the Constitution. But again, we've had 17 amendments that have been approved in, since 1791. All right, that's not a lot. And so that's important to keep in mind. So the question then becomes, well, if it's so hard, I mean, change happens now very quickly. And so there's a need, if our government, if our political system is going to survive, if the Constitution is going to survive, to find other ways to enable change in our political order. And again, this is an example. We've had 11,000 amendments considered. Only 33 have been submitted to the states, only 27 ratified. Let me give you one case study of just how difficult this is. How many people think that flag burning, the burning of the American flag, should be perfectly legal? Anybody? So there was a Supreme Court decision a number of years ago involving it was a Texas case, protester. There was a protest, and a man burned the American flag as part of his protest against the Vietnam War. And under Texas state law, he was convicted. And the case eventually found its way to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that in this particular case, flag burning was speech. It was political expression, and thus the First Amendment protected that act. Not any act of burning the flag, but that act at that time, because it was political expression that was covered by the First Amendment, protected by the First Amendment, and the court therefore overturned his conviction. After that decision, pretty much every congressional session, a constitutional amendment was considered and voted on by members of the House and/or Senate that would have amended the Constitution to make flag burning illegal. Not once in all those years did 2/3 of the members of the House or 2/3 of the members of the Senate vote in favor of that proposed amendment. So I submit to you, I'm not getting into the substance of whether it's a good or a bad thing that they voted the way they did. My point is, if you can't get 2/3 voting on something like that, imagine how difficult it's going to be on some other issue around which there would appear to be less consensus. So amending the Constitution formally is very difficult. However, we have had informal methods of constitutional change. And these deserve some mention because they are important, and I would argue not only are they important, but without them we wouldn't have a constitution, because it can't be, in my judgment, a totally rigid document, not over the course of so many decades and even multiple centuries. So informal methods of constitutional change become critical to the Constitution's survival. First of all, the United States today doesn't look like what it did in 1800, either in terms of the number of people or the size of our country. Secondly, congressional legislation. We know that Congress is given broad powers in the Constitution, not just enumerated or expressed powers that are laid out in Article 1, Section 8, but the powers to the necessary and proper clause enable. And so Congress has broad authority to legislate. Presidential actions are important, especially in the area of foreign policy. Needless to say, in 1790, no nuclear weapons did not exist in the world. Not only did nuclear weapons not exist in the world, but it was a much smaller world because we couldn't move around that rapidly. We couldn't move armies, we couldn't move people. And for that matter, nation states didn't even exist in the way they do now. There are roughly 200 nation states in the world. There are also several failed states in the world. Going back to this notion of implied powers, presidents and the Congress have over time seen that the United States has had all kinds of foreign policy and national security needs as the world has changed. And there's not a great deal of mention of foreign policy in the Constitution. It does say the president is the commander-in-chief. It does say that the Congress has the power of the purse and the power to declare war and so on. But the changes in the world and in the global politics have been enormous. And if we didn't respond in some way, we can argue about whether the United States has always responded in the correct way or the wisest way, but to ignore that change in the world would almost certainly put our country at a serious disadvantage. Judicial review is very important as a method of informal change. There is no provision for judicial review in the Constitution of the United States. Judicial review means that federal courts can review the actions of the Congress and review the actions of the executive branch and determine if and when those acts are constitutional or unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court essentially gave itself that power in 1803 in a very, very important Supreme Court decision known as Marbury versus Madison. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the federal judiciary, but it's important to note that the federal courts and the Supreme Court have that power, but it's also important to note that this is not, does not give the federal judicial review, does not give the federal courts a license to go out and try to right wrongs. People, organizations, groups, states, somebody has to bring a case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court doesn't go out looking for problems. Public opinion changes over time. Sometimes it changes pretty rapidly, even on issues that are seen as controversial, such as gay marriage. And our country has changed in just so many ways in the last 220 some years. So as people, as political officials, as governmental bodies, as judges, as citizens, as we look at the Constitution and look at its words and read its words, we develop new interpretations and as we develop new political customs and practices as the society changes. So, you know, if you think back to the very early days of the Constitution and for that matter, the Declaration, and you know, it lays out the argument for equality. Well, whatever equality meant in 1791, when the framers wrote and the Constitution was ratified, whatever equality meant It didn't include women. It certainly didn't include Native Americans. And it didn't include blacks. And it didn't include many who were propertyless. So over the course of time, our notion of equality and equal protection of the laws has changed. If we would go back to 1791 and say to Madison, well, you know, gee, don't you think homosexuals ought to be able to marry one another? You know, that's the equivalent of saying, can we book a fare on a plane? Planes didn't exist then. The idea of gay marriage was just outside the realm of the political culture and the mentality of the people. Just as the ability to fly was really, the ability to fly might have been there, but the means and resources to do so were not. So things change, and sometimes very quickly over time. And so that's one of the justifications for informal change in the Constitution. Comments or questions at this point? Okay, so just because the anti-federalist position basically didn't prevail, it doesn't follow that their contribution to American political culture is eliminated. And their contribution, it seems to me, includes this: fear of kings, fear of tyranny, fear of concentrated power. At the time of the Anti-Federalists, it was a fear of primarily monarchy or national government's power. The Anti-Federalists were a precursor to ideologies of states' rights, of localism, of the importance of individual liberty over the authority of the national government. And this is reflected in the anti-majoritarian nature of the Constitution. The framers, as we said last time, were concerned that the common people, that majorities would use their power against wealth and property. Most adults didn't have political rights when the Constitution was ratified, and subsequently over time, obviously our political culture has changed. Again, it's important to underscore the framers were men of their time. Few of them, if any, believed in democracy, however one defines it. And by the way, earlier at the beginning of the course, I kind of, glided past the whole question of democracy, but certainly one of the questions, that's critical in thinking about American government is what kind of democracy do we have? I think we talked about that at least briefly. Democracy had a bad name well into the 20th century. Keep in mind, women didn't get the right to vote till after World War I, not even 100 years ago. And saying democracy had a bad name wasn't simply true for the United States, but it was true for most of the world. So one way, and it's a way that is consistent in some ways with my own thinking as well as American political culture, is, and I don't have the term here on the slide, but there is a populist dimension to American political culture. And one can view politics, boatloads of ways one can view politics, but one way is that it's a conflict between the many without property or without very much property and the wealthy few. And we hear that in contemporary political discourse with the 1% or the 99% versus the 1%. And to formulate or to frame American politics in that manner is essentially to say that American politics can be understood in part as a conflict between numbers and money, or between votes and money. And so that's part of the populist legacy, I think, that comes in part from the Anti-Federalists. Any comments or questions? Well, this is my last slide of the morning. And what I want to suggest to you is that the Revolution and the Constitution, the American Revolution and the Constitution, are, looking backwards, appear to be ambiguous in their nature. And what I mean by ambiguous is that they embody contradictions, contradictory ideas and factors. So what I'm arguing then is that the Constitution and the American Revolution were revolutionary in some sense and conservative in other senses. How were they revolutionary? They were revolutionary in that both the Revolution and the Constitution were a rejection of monarchy. Monarchy was the prevailing political system in Europe at the time. The Revolution and especially the Constitution, were revolutionary in rejecting the idea of a national religion, or the merger of having the political ruler be the head of the national religion, or even having a national religion. They rejected that. They rejected authoritarian power that a king or a monarch represented. They agreed that the people, even though the people were more narrowly defined then than they are today, had to have a significant role in the creation and in the sustaining of a government. Further, the Constitution and the American Revolution were revolutionary in the idea that people have rights prior to the existence of government. It was revolutionary in the idea that governments were not ordained by God or gods, that the government that one is born into is not necessarily, in fact, is not a permanent feature of the society, that human beings can come together to create a contract that will in turn provide the basis for a government to exist, and that people can change the government and ought to have the power to change the government if it no longer serves the needs of the country. On the other hand, the Revolution and the Constitution were conservative in that they reject the notion of popular sovereignty consistent with democracy and rule by the many. The framers were not interested in having the great number of adults in the country, males and females, whites and blacks, and whatever other ethnic group was out there, Native Americans, Asians, whoever. The framers were not interested in popular rule. That was not what they were about. The evidence for that is very simply that of all of the national political offices that are laid out in the Constitution, the only office in which people could vote, citizens, just a regular citizen could vote, would be for a member of the House of Representatives. Not the Senate, not the federal courts, not the Supreme Court, not the president. So this is pretty conservative. It's more. It's certainly a step up from I am the king, you are a subject, and you will do what I say or else. It was clearly a departure from that, but they didn't go by any means all the way to a notion of self-rule, popular sovereignty, rights for the normal many people. And there's an ambiguity in the Declaration itself as opposed to early American political practice. And that is, and we've already suggested this, how do you lay out the idea of equality, which is very radical, as Jefferson did in the Constitution, yet be conservative in practice? That practice maintaining slavery, providing no rights for women, no political rights for women. Women, in a sense, were not citizens. Blacks were not citizens, yet still hold the view of all human beings are created equal. There's a disconnect there. At least, you know, we can't put ourselves back into the minds of the framers. This was too difficult an idea for them at the time. Politically difficult because if the Constitution didn't protect slavery, then the southern states weren't going to sign on to the Constitution, pure and simple. And culturally difficult because, you know, in the Western world, women essentially had no political rights unless you were a queen. And so, on the one hand, you have this radical idea of human equality, yet a clear inability to put that into practice in the initial Constitution. And so the idea of equality becomes a kind of value, becomes an idea which animates a great deal of American political history. Because the idea of equality, it would seem, is fundamental to the idea of democracy, in at least many understandings of democracy. Some would argue it's not necessary. I think they're wrong. If you don't have at least political equality, I don't know how you have democracy. If your vote counts as 1 and my vote counts as 500, if that's consistent with democracy, then, you know, black is white, up is down, round is square, at least from my point of view. Comments or questions at this time? Okay, next time we will embark on a discussion of the federal system. This is a really important chapter, and it's a really important issue because the federal system, that is to say, the fact that we have a national government and state governments, is one of the animating tensions in American political life. See you next time. Have a good weekend. Do your homework. Let's see, I forgot to